The open sea has always been a source of both wonder and fear. For centuries, sailors have shared tales of monstrous creatures lurking in the deep, but I never believed them. That changed one fateful night off the coast of Norway when I came face to face with the legendary kraken. I was part of a scientific expedition aboard the research vessel Odyssey, tasked with studying marine life in the North Atlantic. The crew was a mix of seasoned sailors and marine biologists, each with a passion for the ocean. Our mission had been uneventful so far, with only the occasional excitement of a whale sighting or a school of dolphins playing in our wake. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned a deep shade of purple, the sea grew eerily calm. The only sound was the gentle lapping of waves against the hull. It was then that our sonar picked up something massive moving beneath us. At first we thought it was a pod of whales, but the readings were unlike anything we had ever seen. Curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to investigate. We launched a submersible equipped with high-definition cameras and powerful lights. As it descended into the depths, the tension on the ship was palpable. The monitors displayed nothing but darkness for what seemed like an eternity. Then, out of the abyss emerged a colossal shape. The cameras struggled to capture its full size, but it was clear that this was no whale. It was something far more ancient and terrifying. Tentacles as thick as tree trunks writhed in the water, and a massive, beak-like mouth snap hit the submersible. The kraken had risen from the depths. Panic erupted on the Odyssey. The crew scrambled to bring the submersible back to the surface, but the kraken had other plans. One of its massive tentacles wrapped around the submersible, crushing it like a tin can. The cameras went dark, and the feed cut off abruptly. Before we could process what had happened, the ship lurched violently. The kraken had surfaced, and its tentacles were now reaching for the Odyssey. The deck tilted sharply as the creature's immense weight bore down on us. Alarms blared, and chaos ensued as we struggled to maintain our footing. I ran to the deck, hoping to catch a glimpse of the beast. What I saw defied comprehension. The kraken's body was partially visible above the water, its dark, slimy skin glistening in the moonlight. Its eyes, as big as dinner plates, glowed with a malevolent intelligence. The sheer size of the creature was staggering. It dwarfed our vessel, making us feel like mere insects in its presence. The crew fought back with whatever means they had. Flares and distress signals were fired into the sky, hoping to scare the creature away or attract the attention of nearby ships. But the kraken seemed unfazed. It tightened its grip on the Odyssey, and the sound of metal groaning under the pressure filled the air. In a desperate bid to save the ship, our captain ordered us to cut the ropes securing our equipment to the deck. We watched helplessly as thousands of dollars worth of research gear tumbled into the sea, hoping the sacrifice would appease the kraken. But it was no use. The kraken's attack grew more ferocious, and the Odyssey began to take on water. I could hear the screams of my crewmates as they were thrown overboard or crushed by the creature's relentless assault. The ship was sinking, and fast. As the water rose around me, I made a split-second decision to abandon ship. I grabbed a life raft and jumped into the icy waters, praying that I wouldn't be next in the kraken's grasp. The cold water shocked my system, but adrenaline kept me moving. I paddled furiously, trying to put as much distance between myself and the sinking ship as possible. From the raft I watched in horror as the Odyssey was dragged beneath the waves, the kraken's tentacles still wrapped around it. The ship disappeared into the depths, leaving only a swirl of bubbles and debris on the surface. I floated in the open sea for hours, shivering and terrified. The moon cast a pale light on the water, and every ripple sent waves of fear through me. I couldn't shake the image of the kraken's glowing eyes and monstrous tentacles from my mind. Just as dawn began to break, a rescue helicopter appeared on the horizon. They had picked up our distress signals and were searching for survivors. Relief washed over me as they hauled me aboard, but the terror of that night would never leave me. In the days that followed, I tried to make sense of what had happened. The legend of the Kraken was no longer a myth. To me was a horrifying reality. The sea, once a place of wonder, had become a realm of nightmares. I knew that I would never forget my encounter with the Kraken. The creature's immense power and primal fury had left an indelible mark on my soul, and though I survived to tell the tale, a part of me would always remain in the depths, haunted by the terror that lurks beneath the waves. Growing up in the heart of the Navajo Nation, I was well acquainted with the legends and folklore of my people. Stories of skinwalkers or Yinal-Lushi were among the most terrifying. These malevolent beings, said to be able to shapeshift into animals, were whispered about in hushed tones around campfires and at family gatherings. I always thought they were just stories meant to scare children. That was until the night I came face to face with one. It was late autumn, and I had returned home to visit my family. My cousin, John, and I decided to go camping in the nearby forest, a place we had explored countless times as kids. We packed our gear and set off early in the afternoon, eager to relive our childhood adventures. The forest was as beautiful as I remembered, with towering pines and the crisp scent of pine needles in the air. We hiked deep into the woods, far from the main trails, to a secluded spot we used to call our secret haven. As the sun began to set, we set up our camp, built a fire, and settled in for the night. We spent the evening reminiscing about old times, laughing and joking as the fire crackled and the stars appeared overhead. But as the night grew darker, an uneasy feeling settled over me. The forest, which had always felt like a second home, seemed different, more sinister. I tried to shake off the feeling, attributing it to the eerie stories we had been sharing. Around midnight, the fire started to die down, and John suggested we get some sleep. We crawled into our sleeping bags, the firelight casting long shadows across the campsite. I lay there, staring up at the canopy of trees, unable to shake the sense of being watched. Just as I was about to drift off, I heard a rustling sound nearby. I sat up, straining to see into the darkness. The sound grew louder, closer, and my heart began to race. I nudged John awake and whispered, "You hear that?" He grudgingly nodded, and we both listened intently. The rustling stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Then, from the darkness, we heard a low growl, unlike any animal I had ever heard. It sent chills down my spine. "Maybe it's just a coyote," John suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. We both knew that no coyote sounded like that. We decided to stoke the fire, hoping the light and heat would deter whatever was out there. As the flames roared back to life, we caught a glimpse of something moving at the edge of the firelight. It was a large, shadowy figure, too big to be any normal animal. Its eyes glowed a menacing yellow. The creature moved with an unnatural fluidity, circling our campsite. We stood frozen, too scared to move. Then, in a voice that sounded eerily like my mother's, it called out my name. David, the voice echoed through the trees. My blood ran cold. John and I had heard enough stories to know what we were dealing with a skinwalker. They were known to mimic voices to lure their victims. Fear gripped me, but I forced myself to stay calm. We need to leave. Nah, John whispered urgently. We grabbed our backpacks and slowly backed away from the fire, keeping our eyes on the creature. It continued to circle, its glowing eyes never leaving us. As we moved further away, it stepped into the light, revealing its grotesque form. It was a twisted amalgamation of a man and a wolf with long, matted fur and elongated limbs. We turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, not caring about the noise we made. The creature let out a blood-curdling howl and gave chase. I could hear its footsteps behind us, getting closer and closer. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they were going to give out, but the adrenaline kept me moving. We stumbled upon a narrow ravine, too wide to jump across. With no other option, we scrambled down the steep incline, hoping the skinwalker wouldn't follow. I glanced back and saw it standing at the edge, its eyes burning with fury. We reached the bottom and found a small cave just big enough to hide in. We squeezed inside, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. The skinwalker's howls echoed through the night, but it didn't follow us into the ravine. We sat in the cave, too terrified to speak, listening to the creature's frustrated growls. Hours passed, and eventually the sounds faded. Exhausted and shaken, we stayed in the cave until dawn, when we finally felt it was safe to leave. We climbed out of the ravine and made our way back to the campsite, finding it torn apart. Our gear was scattered, and the fire pit was destroyed. We didn't waste any time packing up what little we had left and hightailed it back to the village. When we told our family what had happened, they listened gravely. The elders performed a cleansing ceremony, and we were warned never to venture into those woods again. The encounter left a scar on my soul, a reminder of the dark forces that lurk just beyond the edges of our understanding. To this day, I can't forget the sight of those glowing eyes and the sound of my mother's voice calling out from the darkness. The legend of the Skinwalker was no longer just a story to me. It was a horrifying reality that I would carry with me for the rest of my life. I never believed in urban legends or cryptid tales, thinking them to be mere figments of overactive imaginations. However, an encounter I had one summer night in Michigan's Upper Peninsula changed that forever. It was a warm July evening, and my friends and I decided to go on a camping trip near the Manistee National Forest. The place was known for its serene beauty and dense woods, a perfect getaway from our hectic lives. We arrived at the campsite late in the afternoon, set up our tents, and started a campfire as the sun began to set. As the night wore on, we exchanged ghost stories and laughed around the fire. The forest around us was alive with the sounds of crickets and owls, creating an almost magical atmosphere. Around midnight, my friend Mark suggested we take a walk to a nearby lake he had visited a few years back. Eager for an adventure, we grabbed our flashlights and set off into the woods. The trail to the lake was narrow and winding, the darkness making it seem even more mysterious. We joked and chatted as we walked, the beams of our flashlights cutting through the thick canopy of trees. About halfway to the lake, we noticed the woods had gone eerily silent. The usual cacophony of night sounds had ceased, replaced by an oppressive stillness. We paused, glancing at each other uneasily. "Maybe we should head back," suggested Jenny, the only girl in our group. Mark, ever the adventurous one, laughed it off and urged us to keep going. Reluctantly, we pressed on, but the silence was unnerving. As we neared the lake, we heard a low growl from the darkness. We froze, our flashlights scanning the trees. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. My friends nodded, their faces pale in the dim light. The growl came again, this time closer. We could hear something moving through the underbrush, heavy and deliberate. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to make sense of what could be out there. Suddenly, a pair of glowing red eyes appeared in the darkness, fixed on us. Mark aimed his flashlight at the eyes, revealing a creature that defied explanation. It stood on two legs like a man, but was covered in dark, matted fur. Its head was distinctly canine, with a long snout and sharp, bared teeth. It was massive, towering over us at nearly 7 feet tall. The creature let out a bone-chilling howl, its eyes never leaving us. Paralyzed with fear, we stood there, unable to move. The creature took a step forward, its movements fluid and unnervingly human-like. Mark, finally snapping out of his stupor, yelled, "Run!" We bolted back down the trail, our flashlights bouncing wildly as we ran. The sound of the creature's heavy footsteps echoed behind us, getting closer and closer. My lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, but the adrenaline kept me going. We burst into the campsite, screaming for help. The others, who had stayed behind, looked at us in confusion. "What's going on?" one of them asked, but we didn't stop to explain. We dove into our cars, locking the doors and starting the engines. From the safety of my car, I watched as the creature emerged from the woods, standing at the edge of the campsite. Its red eyes glowed menacingly in the darkness, and it let out another howl before retreating back into the trees. We didn't waste any time speeding away, the terror of what we had seen still fresh in our minds. We drove to the nearest town, where we finally felt safe enough to stop and catch our breath. Mark, usually the skeptic, was the first to speak. "That was the Dogman," he said, his voice shaking. "I've heard stories about it, but I never thought it was real." We spent the rest of the night in a motel, too scared to return to the campsite. The next morning, we went back to collect our things, but the forest seemed different in the daylight. The oppressive fear from the night before was gone, replaced by an eerie calm. We quickly packed up and left, vowing never to return to that part of the forest again. The encounter left us all shaken. I did some research afterward and found that sightings of the Dogman in Michigan date back decades, with many describing the same creature we had seen. Whether it's a cryptid, a supernatural being, or something else entirely, I can't say for sure. All I know is that the night I met the Dogman was the night I became a believer in the unknown. It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway. My friends and I had planned a trip to the remote forests of northern Minnesota, a place known for its untouched beauty and tranquil surroundings. Little did we know, this trip would introduce us to one of the most terrifying legends of the region, Wendigo. We arrived at our cabin on a chilly Friday evening just as the sun was beginning to set. The cabin was rustic, but comfortable, nestled deep in the woods far from any signs of civilization. As night fell, we lit a fire in the fireplace, prepared a hearty meal, and settled in for a cozy evening. Later that night, as we sat around the fire sharing stories, Mike, our self-proclaimed local legend expert, brought up the Wendigo. "You guys ever hear about the Wendigo?" he asked, a mischievous grin on his face. None of us had, so he launched into the tale. The Wendigo, he explained, is a malevolent spirit from Native American folklore, particularly among the Algonquian-speaking tribes. It's said to possess people and turn them into cannibalistic monsters with an insatiable hunger for human flesh. According to legend, the Wendigo roams the forests of the Great Lakes region, especially in winter, driven by an endless craving. As he spoke, the wind outside began to howl, rattling the windows and making the cabin feel even more isolated. We laughed nervously, trying to shake off the eerie feeling that Mike's story had left us with. Eventually, we called it a night and went to bed. In the middle of the night, I was awakened by a strange noise. It sounded like someone or something was scratching at the cabin door. My heart raced as I listened intently, trying to convince myself it was just an animal. But the scratching persisted, accompanied by a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down my spine. I crept out of bed and peeked out the window, but all I could see was darkness. The growling grew louder, more menacing, and I could hear heavy footsteps moving around the cabin. Summoning my courage, I woke Mike and the others, telling them what I had heard. Mike, still half asleep, mumbled something about the Wendigo and stumbled to the door. He unlocked it and slowly opened it, peering outside. "There's nothing there," he said, sounding relieved. "Probably just a raccoon or something." But as we were about to return to bed, we heard it again, a deep, unearthly growl coming from the woods. This time we all heard it clearly. Mike grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, motioning for us to follow. The cold night air hit us as we stepped out onto the porch. The forest was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustling of leaves. Mike shone his flashlight into the darkness, and for a moment we saw nothing. Then, just at the edge of the beam, we caught a glimpse of something that made our blood run cold. Standing among the trees was a tall, emaciated figure with glowing eyes. It looked like a man, but its limbs were unnaturally long and thin, and its skin was a sickly, ashen color. Its eyes burned with a malevolent hunger, and as it moved closer, we could see its mouth filled with sharp, jagged teeth. We froze in terror, unable to comprehend what we were seeing. The creature let out another guttural growl and lunged towards us. Mike dropped the flashlight and yelled for us to run. We bolted back into the cabin, slamming the door shut and locking it. Inside, we huddled together, trying to figure out what to do. The growling and scratching continued, growing more intense. It was as if the creature was trying to break down the door. In a panic, we barricaded the door with furniture and grabbed whatever we could find to defend ourselves. The night seemed to stretch on forever, the relentless assault on the cabin never letting up. We could hear the creature circling the cabin, its growls and snarls piercing the night. Every creak and groan of the cabin sent us into a fresh wave of terror. Finally, as dawn began to break, the sounds stopped. We waited, holding our breath, afraid that it was some kind of trick. But as the light grew stronger, we dared to peek outside. The creature was gone, leaving behind only claw marks on the door and strange, hoof-like tracks in the dirt. Exhausted and terrified, we packed up our things and left the cabin as quickly as we could. On the drive back, none of us spoke much, each lost in our thoughts about the horrifying encounter. Later, I did some research and found out that sightings of the Wendigo or creatures like it have been reported in the region for centuries. Many people have claimed to hear the same growls, see the same glowing eyes, and find the same tracks. To this day, I can't explain what we saw or what happened that night. But one thing is certain, the legend of the Wendigo is more than just a story. It's a warning, a reminder that there are things in this world that we may never fully understand. It was the fall of 2010, and I had just moved to Point Pleasant, West Virginia, to start a new job. The town was quaint, with a rich history and a sense of community that made me feel welcome immediately. But as I soon discovered, Point Pleasant had a dark legend that lingered in the minds of the local Mothman. I first heard about the Mothman from my neighbor, Mrs. Harper, an elderly woman with a penchant for storytelling. She recounted the eerie events of the 1960s, when sightings of a strange, winged creature had terrified the town. The creature was described as a humanoid with glowing red eyes and enormous wings. Mrs. Harper swore that the Mothman was a harbinger of doom, appearing before catastrophic events. I was skeptical, chalking it up to local folklore and overactive imaginations. But one night, everything changed. I was driving home from work late, the road deserted and the sky dark. As I neared the old T&T area series of abandoned munitions bunkers from World War III, saw something that made my heart skip a beat. A pair of glowing red eyes stared at me from the side of the road. I slowed down, squinting into the darkness, and saw a tall, dark figure standing there. Its eyes were fixed on me, and blinking. The figure unfurled a pair of massive wings and took off into the night sky with a rush of wind. I slammed on the brakes, my mind racing. Had I just seen the Mothman? I drove home in a daze, my heart pounding in my chest. That night I couldn't sleep, my mind replaying the encounter over and over. The next morning, I decided to visit the local library to learn more about the Mothman. I found numerous accounts of sightings, each eerier than the last. Some people reported the creature flying over their cars. Others saw it perched on rooftops or lurking in the shadows. One story in particular caught my attention. It was about the collapse of the Silver Bridge in 1967, a tragic event that claimed the lives of 46 people. Many witnesses reported seeing the Mothman near the bridge in the days leading up to the disaster. The idea that this creature was somehow connected to such a tragedy sent chills down my spine. Over the next few weeks, I became obsessed with the Mothman. I interviewed locals, visited the sites of previous sightings, and even stayed up late into the night, hoping for another glimpse of the creature. My obsession grew, fueled by the fear and curiosity that had taken root in my mind. One evening, as I was walking near the TNT area, I heard a strange, high-pitched screech. I stopped in my tracks, my heart racing. The screech was followed by a rustling of wings, and I felt a rush of wind behind me. I turned around slowly, dreading what I might see. There it was, perched on top of an old Bunkerth Mothman. Its eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and its wings spread wide, casting a shadow over the ground. The creature seemed to be watching me, studying me. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or speak. The Mothman let out another screech and took off into the sky, disappearing into the night. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my mind struggling to process what I had just witnessed. When I finally gathered the courage to move, I ran home as fast as I could. I knew then that the Mothman was real. The fear I felt was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was as if the creature had looked into my very soul, leaving me with a sense of impending doom. In the days that followed, I noticed a change in the town. People were on edge, and there was an unspoken tension in the air. Rumors of strange sightings and unexplained events spread like wildfire. It was as if the Mothman's presence had awakened something dark and sinister. One night I was awoken by a loud crash. I ran to the window and saw that a large tree had fallen in my backyard, narrowly missing my house. As I stood there, catching my breath, I saw the glowing red eyes again, watching me from the shadows. The fear was overwhelming. I felt like I was being hunted, stalked by an unseen predator. The Mothman had marked me, and there was no escaping its gaze. I knew I had to leave Point Pleasant before it was too late. I packed my bags and left the town the next day, my heart heavy with dread. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The Mothman had become a part of my life, a dark presence that I couldn't escape. To this day, I can't explain what I saw or why it happened to me. But I know one thing for certain: the Mothman is real, and its presence is a warning, a harbinger of doom that leaves a trail of fear and tragedy in its wake. It was a chilly autumn evening in 1990 when I first encountered the beast of Bray Road. I had just moved to Elkhorn, Wisconsin, a small town known for its quiet charm and picturesque landscapes. Little did I know, this seemingly peaceful town held a dark secret, a legendary creature that roamed the countryside. I was driving home from a late shift at the local diner, the road ahead illuminated by my headlights. As I turned onto Bray Road, I felt a strange sense of unease, like something was watching me. I brushed it off as my imagination, but that feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing mile. Suddenly, a figure darted across the road in front of me. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding in my chest. I squinted into the darkness, trying to make out what I had just seen. At first I thought it was a large dog or a wolf, but as it moved into the beam of my headlights, I realized it was something far more terrifying. The creature stood on two legs, its body covered in dark, matted fur. Its eyes glowed with an eerie yellow light, and its mouth was filled with sharp, jagged teeth. It looked like a monstrous cross between a wolf and a man. I had heard the local legends about the beast of Bray Road, but I never thought I would see it with my own eyes. I was frozen in place, unable to move as the beast stared at me. It seemed to be sizing me up, deciding whether I was a threat. After what felt like an eternity, it turned and disappeared into the woods, leaving me shaken and terrified. I drove home as fast as I could, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. That night I couldn't sleep, my mind racing with thoughts of the creature. The next morning, I decided to visit the local library to learn more about the Beast of Bray Road. I found numerous accounts of sightings, each more chilling than the last. Some people reported seeing the creature stalking livestock, while others claimed it had chased their vehicles. The descriptions were always the same: a large, bipedal wolf-like creature with glowing eyes and a menacing presence. Over the next few weeks, I became obsessed with the Beast of Bray Road. I spent my evenings driving up and down the road, hoping to catch another glimpse of the creature. My obsession grew, fueled by the fear and curiosity that had taken hold of me. One night, as I was driving along Bray Road, I heard a strange guttural growl coming from the woods. I stopped the car and listened, my heart pounding in my chest. The growl was followed by the sound of rustling leaves and snapping branches. I knew the beast was close. I grabbed my flashlight and got out of the car, my hands trembling. I shone the light into the woods, my breath visible in the cold night air. The beam of the flashlight caught a pair of glowing yellow eyes, and I felt a surge of fear. The beast stepped into the light, its eyes fixed on me. It let out a low, menacing growl, its teeth bared. I backed away slowly, trying to keep my composure. The beast took a step forward, and I knew I had to get out of there. I ran back to the car and sped away. The image of the creature burned into my mind. I knew then that the Beast of Bray Road was real, and it was more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I noticed strange footprints around my property, and at night I heard eerie howls in the distance. The beast was out there, lurking in the shadows, and I was its prey. One evening, I decided to set up a camera outside my house, hoping to capture evidence of the beast. I reviewed the footage the next morning, my heart racing with anticipation. At first, there was nothing unusual, just the usual nighttime activity of the local wildlife. But then I saw a beast moving silently through the yard, its eyes glowing in the darkness. I showed the footage to the local authorities, but they dismissed it as a hoax or a misidentification. They didn't believe in the Beast of Bray Road. But I knew what I had seen. The creature was real, and it was dangerous. The fear became too much to bear. I couldn't stay in Elkhorn any longer, knowing that the beast was out there, watching and waiting. I packed my bags and left town, hoping to escape the nightmare that had taken over my life. Even now, years later, I can't forget the terror of that encounter. The Beast of Bray Road is more than just a legend. It's a living nightmare that haunts the woods of Wisconsin. I only hope that one day the truth about the creature will be revealed and the town of Elkhorn can finally find peace. Growing up in a small village in Puerto Rico, I was no stranger to tales of the supernatural. Ghost stories, witches, and legends of strange creatures were common topics around campfires and family gatherings. But there was one legend that stood out among the rest: Chupacabra, the infamous goat-sucker. The first time I heard about the Chupacabra, I was 10 years old. My grandfather told me about it as we sat on the porch one warm evening. He described a creature with spines down its back, glowing red eyes, and a thirst for the blood of livestock. It sounded like a story meant to scare children, but the fear in my grandfather's eyes told me otherwise. Years later, when I was in my 20s, I had an experience that made me believe in the legend. It was a particularly hot summer, and the villagers were on edge. Livestock had been found dead, drained of blood with puncture wounds on their necks. Whispers of the chupacabra spread like wildfire, and a sense of dread hung over the village. One night I was woken by the frantic barking of our family dog, Luna. She was usually a calm and friendly dog, but that night she was hysterical. I got out of bed and went to check on her, wondering what had her so agitated. As I stepped outside, I heard a strange, low growling sound coming from the direction of our chicken coop. The air was thick with tension, and Luna's barking grew louder. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously made my way toward the coop, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached the coop, I found the door slightly ajar. I shone the flashlight inside and froze. There, amidst the terrified chickens, was a creature unlike anything I had ever seen. It was about the size of a small dog, with leathery gray skin and spines running down its back. Its eyes glowed a menacing red in the beam of the flashlight, and it let out a hiss that sent chills down my spine. I stood there, paralyzed with fear, as the creature turned its attention to me. It moved with a strange, jerky motion, almost as if it was gliding across the ground. Luna's barking seemed to snap me out of my trance, and I slowly backed away, not wanting to provoke the creature. Suddenly, the chupacabra lunged at me, its teeth bared and claws extended. I stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight, and landed hard on the ground. The creature was almost upon me when Luna, in a display of bravery I had never seen before, charged at it, barking and snarling. The chupacabra hesitated, then turned and fled into the night, disappearing into the darkness. I scrambled to my feet and grabbed Luna, holding her close as I tried to calm my racing heart. The chickens were still clucking in panic, but they were unharmed, thanks to Luna's intervention. The next day, I told my family what had happened. My father was skeptical, but my grandfather believed me. He said that the chupacabra was real and that we needed to be cautious. We reinforced the chicken coop and made sure our animals were secure, but the fear lingered. Over the following weeks, more livestock fell victim to the chupacabra. Farmers found their goats, chickens, and even some small dogs dead, drained of blood with the same puncture wounds on their necks. The villagers held meetings, trying to come up with ways to protect their animals and themselves. One night, a group of us decided to set a trap for the chupacabra. We used a goat as bait, tying it to a post in a clearing near the edge of the village. We hid in the bushes, armed with flashlights and makeshift weapons, waiting for the creature to appear. Hours passed, and just as we were about to give up, we heard a rustling in the bushes. The goat bleated in fear, and we saw a pair of glowing red eyes emerge from the darkness. The chupacabra stepped into the clearing, its spines bristling as it approached the goat. We sprang into action, shining our flashlights on the creature and shouting to scare it away. The chupacabra hissed and snarled, but it didn't flee. It seemed more aggressive, more desperate. It lunged at us, and we fought back, using sticks and stones to drive it away. The battle was intense, and the creature's strength and agility were terrifying. But eventually, we managed to drive it off, chasing it back into the woods. We were exhausted, but we had succeeded in protecting our livestock that night. The attacks continued sporadically over the next few months, but they gradually became less frequent. The villagers remained vigilant, always on guard for signs of the chupacabra. The fear never completely went away, but we learned to live with it, accepting it as part of life in our village. To this day, I can still remember the sight of the chupacabra in the beam of my flashlight, its red eyes glowing with an otherworldly menace. Some people say that the creature is just a myth, a product of overactive imaginations. But I know the truth. The chupacabra is real, and it still haunts the shadows of the night, lurking just out of sight, waiting for its next victim. Growing up in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey, I often heard stories about the Jersey Devil. It was said to be a creature with the head of a goat, wings of a bat, and the body of a horse. The locals told tales of eerie encounters, strange dozes, and mutilated livestock, but I always dismissed them as folklore meant to scare kids. Little did I know that one day I would come face to face with this legendary beast. It was late autumn, and the air was crisp with the promise of winter. My friends and I decided to go camping in the Pine Barrens, eager for one last adventure before the cold set in. We set up camp near a secluded lake, far from the nearest town. The isolation was part of the appeal, a chance to disconnect from the world and immerse ourselves in nature. That first night, as we sat around the campfire, the conversation inevitably turned to the Jersey Devil. Mike, the self-proclaimed skeptic of the group, scoffed at the idea of a mythical creature lurking in the woods. But Sarah, who had grown up hearing the stories from her grandparents, swore she had seen strange things in the forest at night. As the fire died down and we prepared to turn in, I couldn't shake a sense of unease. The forest was eerily quiet, and the shadows seemed to dance and twist in the flickering light of the dying fire. We retreated to our tents, and I tried to sleep, but my mind kept drifting back to the stories of the Jersey Devil. In the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by a loud, blood-curdling scream. It echoed through the forest, sending chills down my spine. My friends were awake, too, their faces pale and eyes wide with fear. We huddled together, listening intently, but the scream did not come again. The next morning, we debated whether to stay or leave. Mike, still skeptical, insisted it was just a coyote or some other animal. But Sarah was visibly shaken, and I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling of dread in my gut. In the end, we decided to stay, convinced that we were just letting our imaginations get the better of us. That day, we explored the forest, marveling at the beauty of the changing leaves and the crisp, clean air. But as the sun began to set, the sense of unease returned. We gathered around the campfire once more, trying to shake off the lingering fear from the previous night. As darkness fell, the forest seemed to come alive with strange sounds. We heard rustling in the bushes, the snapping of twigs, and faint, eerie cries in the distance. Mike tried to lighten the mood with jokes, but his laughter was hollow, and we all knew he was just as scared as the rest of us. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from the direction of the lake. We grabbed our flashlights and cautiously made our way to the shore. The beam of my flashlight revealed something that made my blood run cold. Large, hoof-like prints in the mud leading away from the water and into the forest. Sarah gasped and clutched my arm, her eyes wide with terror. "It's the Jersey Devil," she whispered, her voice trembling. Mike tried to brush it off, but even he couldn't hide the fear in his eyes. We followed the tracks for a short distance, but they disappeared into the dense underbrush. Reluctantly, we returned to camp, our nerves on edge. That night, sleep was elusive. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent waves of fear through our camp. Around midnight, the blood-curdling scream echoed through the forest once more, louder and closer than before. We bolted upright, our hearts pounding in our chests. The scream was followed by a series of heavy footsteps, getting closer and closer. We huddled together, our flashlights flickering as we scanned the darkness. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped, and a deathly silence fell over the forest. Just as we began to relax, a shadowy figure emerged from the trees. It was tall, with large, leathery wings and glowing red eyes. The creature let out another scream, its piercing gaze fixed on us. We were frozen with terror, unable to move or even breathe. The Jersey Devil took a step towards us, its hooves crunching on the dry leaves. In a panic, Mike grabbed a burning log from the campfire and swung it at the creature. The Jersey Devil recoiled, letting out a screech of pain before disappearing into the night. We didn't wait to see if it would return. Grabbing our essentials, we fled the campsite, running through the forest as fast as we could. The sounds of the night seemed to follow us, the eerie cries and heavy footsteps echoing in our ears. We didn't stop until we reached the safety of our car. Breathless and shaken, we drove back to town in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The experience had left us terrified and bewildered, and we knew we would never forget that night. In the days that followed, we tried to make sense of what had happened. Mike, ever the skeptic, insisted that it must have been a bear or some other animal. But Sarah and I knew the truth. We had come face to face with the legendary Jersey Devil, and we had lived to tell the tale. The Pine Barrens, once a place of beauty and adventure, had become a place of nightmares, and though we vowed never to return, the memory of that night would haunt us forever. A chilling reminder that some legends are rooted in reality, and some creatures are better left undisturbed. Living in the deserts of New Mexico, I often heard whispers about the Skinwalkers. These legendary shapeshifters were said to be Navajo witches who could transform into animals and possess unimaginable dark powers. The tales were deeply rooted in Native American folklore, and most people dismissed them as just that folklore. But one night I discovered the horrifying truth. It was a hot summer evening, and my friends and I decided to go camping near an isolated canyon known for its breathtaking views and eerie silence. We set up camp just as the sun was setting, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple. The beauty of the place was mesmerizing, but an unsettling feeling lingered in the air. After setting up our tents, we gathered around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. Inevitably, the conversation turned to the local legends, and someone mentioned the Skinwalkers. I could see the unease in everyone's eyes. but we laughed it off, attributing our nervousness to the eerie surroundings. As the night grew darker, the canyon seemed to come alive with strange sounds. The wind howled through the rocks, creating an unsettling symphony of whispers and wails. We decided to call it a night and retreated to our tents, hoping for a good night's sleep. I was just drifting off when a rustling sound outside my tent snapped me awake. I strained my ears, trying to make out the source of the noise. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling our campsite. My heart pounded in my chest, but I convinced myself it was just a curious animal. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment there was silence. Then a low, guttural growl broke the stillness, sending chills down my spine. I sat up, trying to peer through the tent flap, but it was too dark to see anything. Suddenly, my friend's tent zipped open, and he stumbled out, his face pale and eyes wide with terror. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice shaking. Before I could respond, another growl echoed through the canyon, this time closer. We grabbed our flashlights and stepped outside, scanning the darkness. The beams of light cut through the night, revealing nothing but shadows and rocks. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming, and I couldn't shake the sense of impending doom. As we stood there, trying to make sense of the situation, a figure appeared at the edge of our campsite. It was tall and gaunt, with long, matted hair and eyes that glowed eerily in the darkness. It let out a chilling laugh, the sound echoing off the canyon walls. My blood ran cold. This was no ordinary animal. It was something much more sinister. The figure began to move towards us, its body shifting and contorting in unnatural ways. In a flash, it transformed into a large, menacing coyote, its eyes still glowing with malevolence. We backed away slowly, our minds racing with fear and confusion. The coyote advanced, its growls growing louder and more menacing. Just when I thought we were done for, it stopped, sniffing the air. Then, with a final, bone-chilling howl, it turned and disappeared into the night. We didn't waste any time. We packed up our gear as quickly as possible, the adrenaline fueling our movements. As we hurried back to our car, the eerie sounds of the canyon seemed to follow us, reminding us that we were not alone. The drive back to town was a blur. We barely spoke, each of us lost in our thoughts, trying to process what had just happened. The fear lingered, a constant reminder of our brush with the unknown. In the days that followed, we tried to convince ourselves that it was all just a bad dream, a trick of the mind. But deep down, we knew the truth. We had encountered a Skinwalker, and the experience had left a permanent mark on our souls. The legends of the Navajo were not just stories. They were warnings, and we had learned the hard way that some things are better left undisturbed. The desert, with its haunting beauty and ancient secrets, held many mysteries, and we had only scratched the surface. Even now I can't forget those glowing eyes, the sinister laughter, and the feeling of pure, unadulterated fear. The Skinwalker was real, and it was out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. Growing up in a small town in Puerto Rico, I had always heard tales of the chupacabra mythical creature, known for its blood-sucking habits and terrifying appearance. It was said to prey on livestock, leaving a trail of dead animals in its wake. The stories were enough to give any child nightmares, but I never imagined I would one day come face to face with the beast. It was the summer of 1995, and a series of unexplained livestock deaths had the town on edge. Farmers were finding their goats, and chickens drained of blood with strange puncture marks on their necks. The local newspapers were filled with sensational headlines about the chupacabra, and the fear in the community was palpable. One night, my cousin Luis and I decided to stay at our grandparents' farm to help keep an eye on the animals. We set up a makeshift camp in the barn, armed with flashlights and a couple of old baseball bats. We were determined to catch whatever was responsible for the attacks, though we didn't quite believe the chupacabra was real. As the night wore on, the crickets chirped, and the occasional rustling of leaves added to the eerie atmosphere. Luis and I took turns keeping watch, trying to stay awake despite the oppressive heat and humidity. Around midnight, just as I was starting to doze off, a chilling sound broke the silence. A low, guttural growl coming from the edge of the woods. Luis and I exchanged nervous glances, our hearts pounding in our chests. We grabbed our flashlights and crept outside, the beams cutting through the darkness. The growling grew louder, more menacing, as we approached the tree line. Suddenly, something darted out of the shadows, moving with incredible speed. Our flashlight caught a glimpse of a tan, emaciated, hairless creature with glowing red eyes and sharp, protruding fangs. It was unlike anything I had ever seen, and the sight of it sent a wave of terror through me. The creature lunged at us, and we swung our bats wildly, trying to fend it off. It was fast, too fast, and it easily dodged our clumsy attempts to strike it. With a final blood-curdling screech, it turned and fled back into the woods, leaving us shaken and breathless. We ran back to the barn, our nerves frayed, and locked the doors behind us. For the rest of the night, we sat in silence, too scared to sleep. The image of the chupacabra haunted our thoughts, and we knew that what we had seen was no mere animal. The next morning, we told our grandparents what had happened. They were skeptical at first, but the fear in our eyes convinced them. They called the local authorities, and a team was sent out to investigate. They found tracks leading into the woods, but no sign of the creature itself. In the days that followed, more livestock were found dead, their bodies drained of blood. The town was gripped by fear, and many people refused to go out after dark. The legend of the chupacabra had become all too real, and its presence cast a dark shadow over our community. Years have passed since that terrifying summer, but I can still see those glowing red eyes in my nightmares. The chupacabra is more than just a legend. It is a living, breathing nightmare that lurks in the shadows, waiting to strike. To this day, I avoid the woods at night, and I can't look at goats or chickens without remembering the terror we felt. The chupacabra is real, and it is out there, hidden in the darkness, a reminder that some monsters are not just figments of our imagination, but very real threats that walk among us.